rest of us will be turning to Revelation 18. If you didn't get your notes, just let Jim know. He has the ability to. You got yours? He has the ability to hand those to you. He's very good that way. If you don't raise your hand, he won't give them to you. Okay, there you go. We're in chapter 18, which is the, I'm going to say, more or less the conclusion of what we saw beginning in chapter 16, the end, and then the seven angels begin in chapter 17 to dispense with the seven bowls, which followed the seven trumpets, which followed the seven seals. And the more I've been involved this time through, my fifth time through teaching Revelation, the more I have appreciated I'm going to use the word complexity because it really is complex. But at the same time, the logic of how God laid things out. This is, after all, the apocalypse, the revelation, the unveiling of Jesus Christ to us. He's giving us the final story. And he lays it out in such a manner that, and I know at times as you've read the book of the Revelation, you remember the seven horses, and then you remember the destruction and the burning and the beast and the false prophet. You remember all those things, which is good, but something that we too often miss in our quick reads is these little interjections of God just kind of pulling through the page and winking at us, saying, it's all about me, got it under control, and then he goes back and we continue with the story. We're going to see that today as we go through the rest of chapter 18. And you realize, all of you who attend on a regular basis, when I said the rest of chapter 18, you're going, yeah, whatever. But we'll see. We begin in verse 9, and I'm going to read the section verses 9 through 13, because it is a section. And the kings of the earth, who committed acts of sexual immorality and lived luxuriously with her, will weep and mourn over her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance because of the fear of her torment, saying, woe, woe, the great city Babylon, the strong city, for 1 hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn over her, because no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold, silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet, every kind of citron wood, every article of ivory, and every article made from very valuable wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, perfume, frankincense, wine, olive oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, and cargoes of horses, carriages or chariots. And then I'll read slaves and human lives, but we'll get to that as I explain what these things are. Now typically I would go back and review, but honestly I have too high a goal to finish this today, so we're not going to do it. However, I do need to let you look, which is not in your notes, but it's in the Bible, chapter 17, verse 18. The woman whom you saw, John, the angel says to him, is the great city, which reigns over the kings of the earth. So when we talk about Babylon, we're talking, it's the name, or rather the great harlot, the great prostitute, a great whore, depending on your translation, it's all the same thing, is the city. It is Babylon. Well, what is Babylon? Well, the interesting thing about Babylon is that it is not described with one word. I mean, if you say Babylon, you immediately think of maybe Nebuchadnezzar and the place by the Euphrates River, etc., which is true. But he just said that the woman, the prostitute, is the city. And we already know that she's much more than a location. Now, the whole thing is that it is also a location. You go, okay, now I'm confused. Don't be. Because God lays these things out, and just like we can see back in Daniel 7, the kings are kings, but they're also kingdoms. So I call it the accordion. It's this, but it's also just this. It's the king, but it's also the kingdom. Just like the beast. The beast is a antichrist. He is the personification of everything that is evil and anti-God and anti-creator and anti-Christian and anti-Jesus and well, you get the idea. And yet he's also his kingdom. So when you understand that Babylon, yes, it is a location, but it's more than that. And we're going to see as we conclude chapter 18 that it's not just one thing. So, what do we see? For those of you who still, I don't know if anybody downloaded the full chapter, which was, I called it a bonus, but Babylon the Great is referred to in verse 2. Babylon the strong city is referred to in what I just read in verse 10. It'll be referred to again in verse 18, what city is like the great city, so that's Babylon. The whole matter of wealth was mentioned in verse 3. It won't be mentioned, it wasn't mentioned here, just the things that cause the wealth. But in verse 15 it's mentioned, in verse 17 it's mentioned, and again in verse 19 it's mentioned. So that's the wealth. God is behind all this. In verse 5, her sins piled up all the way to heaven, and God remembered. And then in verse 8, all these things came about. She was burned up, for the Lord God who judges her is strong. Now, keep that in mind, because what we saw in verse 10, which I did read, the kings of the earth talk about Babylon, the strong city. And there's so many of these things where you have this. On the one hand, you have the beast doing this. On the other hand, you have God, basically, I can't even do this. It's like this. So the beast does his thing, but he's mimicking and imaging and copying all that God is, and you can see that he can never do that because he's finite, he's limited, he's a created being. God, on the other hand, is God. So I mean, my arms are just not long enough to do all that. So God is the strong one. He's the strong one, even though we're going to see in a moment that the kings call Babylon the strong city. We're going to find a period of time in verse 8. For this reason, in one day her plagues come. In verse, which I read in verse 10, for in 1 hour your judgment has come, referring to Babylon. In verse 17, we're going to see in 1 hour such wealth was made desolate. Again in verse 19, in 1 hour she has been laid waste. So we see a time element here. We saw in verse 8 that God judges. And in verse 10, again, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. And we'll see that again in the surprise verse, the peekaboo verse in verse 20. We'll see that again. And then there's other things that will come into the next section. So we have two major players in this section that I read. The kings of the earth, and then the merchants of the earth. The kings of the earth, we more or less understand kings of the earth. I mean, you could say kings, okay, that's one. Presidents, prime ministers, dictators, all the people who say they're in charge. That's the kings of the earth. And they were complicit in her immorality, and they lived sensuously with her. I'm going to admit something. Recently I signed up for X, and hopefully by now I don't have to add this little addition, which used to be Twitter, although I just did. So I signed up for X. And all of a sudden my eyes are open to the horrible things in the world that I thought I was intelligent and I thought I was informed. The very thing that I just read here, who committed acts of immorality and lived sensuously with her. That's what our world, that's very bad stuff. Okay. It's beyond stealing and lying. It's living in a manner in which, like the prodigal son lived. He did whatever he wanted. That's what the kings of the earth do. The immorality level is so deep and broad that honestly, I just sat there with my eyes wide open saying, oh my goodness. Well, they're going to weep and lament over her when they see the smoke of her burning, and they're going to stand at a distance because of the fear of her torment, and they're going to have a response, which we're going to see 3 different times. One here from the kings says, woe, woe, the great city, Babylon, the strong city. Why are they saying that? For in 1 hour your judgment has come. Well, keep in mind, there's the whole matter in chapter 17 in which the Babylon, the great city, has been turned on by these people. Not necessarily these particular kings, because keep in mind there's actually levels of kings. There's the movers and shakers up here, and then there's a whole level of mover and shakers below them. And honestly, I think these are the movers and shakers below the movers and the shakers up here. But it's potato. I wouldn't argue either way. But these kings of the earth are complicit in her having been the leader in this sensual, seductive, immoral, and sorcerous, blasphemous, idolatrous position that she held. We find that it's also a religious system, it's an economic system, it's an influential system, and it's an immoral system. It's a system. And who is it run by necessarily? I think it's run by the false prophet. But I won't argue that point either. The kings of the earth, for some reason, stand apart. They're fearful of the judgment. And I don't know. Over the years, I think back to my elementary days when they still spanked. Anybody remember those days? And you remember that if someone was being spanked, you kind of stood over there. You didn't want to be close to that. Well, that's kind of the attitude here. They realize that Babylon is being spanked. Only it's a huge spank. All right. We move on to the second. The merchants of the earth in verse 11 will weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargo anymore. No one buys their cargo anymore. That's verse 11. Quickly find what word that is. No one, agoras, that is markets, buys, yet no longer. So in other words, there's an end. You want to sell your wares, you stand out in the street and there's not a single person on the street. It's like, this ain't good for sales. I don't think I'm going to make much money today. Well, that's the whole concept. And I'm not going to spend any time in this except for the last 2 items in this long list. There are 7 categories here, including some things I didn't even think about. Of course, the precious metals, the furniture, the animals, the spices, and there's more. But the last 2, in fact, let me get those notes. I read it this way. After chariots or whatever, and bodies, even human lives. And most translators translate it as slaves, and then of course humans, but it's the whole matter of human trafficking, which, as a kid I thought I'd hear these weird stories about somebody catching somebody with somebody in their house that was a slave, and I thought, didn't slavery end like in 1865? I mean, just in my mind, I'm thinking that as a kid. But the whole matter of human trafficking has not slowed down. It's accelerated. And we see that right here. So the merchants of the earth are doing all these things. And by the way, all these things were available back in John's day. But if they were available back in John's day, they're a whole lot more available today, around the world. So, we finish up that section. We move on to the next section, which is 14 through 20. The fruit you long for has gone from you, and all things that were luxurious and splendid have passed away from you, and men will no longer find them. The merchants of these things, who became rich from her, will stand at a distance because of the fear of her torment, weeping and mourning, saying, woe, woe, the great city, she who was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, for in 1 hour such great wealth has been laid waste. And every shipmaster, or helmsman, or sea captain, depending on your translation, and every passenger and sailor, and as many as make their living by the sea, stood at a distance and were crying out as they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, What city is like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads and were crying out, weeping and mourning, saying, Woe, woe, the great city, in which all who had ships at sea became rich by her wealth, for in 1 hour she has been laid waste. And I'll stop there before I get to verse 20, because verse 20 is a conclusion of this, but it's really different. So what do we see in this portion? We see the merchants again, but we see a phrase in verse 14, which we're going to find in the conclusion, the finale, in verses 21 through 24. And that's in verse 14. And by the way, the fruit, it's an interesting phrase. Where is my notes? There they are. It's an interesting phrase. It says, Lenski says, and the flush season of the lust of thy life went away from thee. The King James says, and the fruits that thy soul lusted after are departed from thee. The New American Standard is actually my least favorite. The fruit you long for has gone from you. So this is how Lenski would translate it. The heyday of your youth is gone. But the heyday of your youth, you've heard the phrase, you sowed your wild oats when you were young. Well, that's what this is. And those days are gone. They're departed. They're done. But the whole matter is it's the heart's desire, but it's a desire for evil. So it's the lust of your youth, all of that you got from that, all your poor decisions, the bad decisions you made, it's all been taken and dumped in the wastebasket and then set on fire. So not a good way to begin this portion, but that's really what it says. The fruit you long for, you lusted after, is gone from you, and all things that were luxurious and splendid, they're gone, and men will no longer find them. It's and the phrase is literally ume, which is not or never, and then uketi, which is again, never again, ever, never ever. So no one's going to find it. Like opening your cupboards in a brand new place and there's nothing there, not even cobwebs. The merchants of all the things that we've already talked about and all the things that are now gone from the lust of the Babylon, they became rich from her. They too are standing at a distance because of fear of her torment. They're also weeping and crying. And they say, woe, woe, the great city, but they don't say the strong city. The king said that. They talk about the things that were a part of their activity. She was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet and adorned, that is, with gold and precious stones and pearls. So she was rich. The merchants made her rich. She made the merchants rich. It was a very reciprocal, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine situation. And they say, bad news, bad news. It's done. Verse 17, for 1 hour, there it is again, such great wealth, there it is again, has been laid waste, made desolate. There is no wealth here. You literally open the cupboards and there's nothing there. In fact, you go to where the cupboards were and there's no cupboards. Now we get to a second group in this portion, which will actually then be a third group and then a fourth group. We have every shipmaster, that's helmsman, it can be ship captain, it's probably more the pilot, so the guy actually moving the ship, and then everybody who rides in the ship, and then every sailor, and as many as make their living by the sea, so that's anybody on the sea. When I visited Banda Aceh, I flew from Japan to Malaysia, and then from Malaysia across the Straits of Malacca to Indonesia, to Banda Aceh. And the strait, I mean, it's looks like it's only as wide from here to Parkhill Road, so it doesn't look that wide, but I looked down and It was like LA traffic. There was just ships and ships and ships and ships and ships. I thought, wow, I never would have thought that in my brain. Never got there. So there's a lot of shipping going on. Remember when COVID hit and we didn't get our cargoes from Asia? All of a sudden you're not getting stuff because the shipping isn't shipping. Or it's shipped and then it sits out in LA Harbor. So there's passengers, there's sailors, there's those who make their living by the sea. They are also, I don't want to say aloof, I think they're careful. They're crying out as they saw the smoke of her burning. And they ask a question. What city is like the great city? There was nothing like the system. The system, the location, the activities, the purpose, the whole entity of Babylon was huge. And they're saying nothing was like it. The system worked. And guess what? Now they're literally weeping and mourning like people do at gravesides or a certain loss. And their response, as they cry out, they throw dust on their heads, which was, everybody back at that day would know that I'm like Job. This is bad. I throw dust on my head. I'm sorrowful in my soul. And they say, woe, woe, the great city, in which all who had ships at sea became rich by her wealth. For in 1 hour, and that's the last time we see that in this chapter, she has been laid waste. So we have now, in a sense, the conclusion. We're going to see a conclusion in verse 20 in just a moment. But we have this, the world. I've struggled with using a name, but if I said a certain female Democrat name that is no longer a Democrat, she was here and everybody fawned over her, and then she moved here and then moved here, and the vitriol was dumped on her. She was vilified, cursed, all that stuff. And that's the same principle we see here. The whole world says, yes, you're a part of us and we're a part of you, until the shoe no longer feels comfortable. And then in chapter 17, they all did this, and they turned against her. And then apparently not everybody necessarily would like that. And we see that in chapter 18, but we recognize in chapter 18 the matter of the mercantilism, the merchandising, the merchants, the financial relationship of the world to the system. And it's gone kaput. There's come an end. And I find this fascinating, especially when we read earlier how people could not buy or sell without the mark of the beast. So something goes awry with that whole system, because these people have to be involved in that system in order to make money. They have to be involved with that system. So what happened? And that's where I have to say I don't know what happened. But in all of this, and this is, I told Kathy on the way here, I'm going to make a statement. After verse 19 into verse 20, here we go. And now, a word from our sponsor. Verse 20. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her. I mean, that gives me chills. Because guess what? Rejoice, because God wins. The world loses. Yay! Yay! We're on the winning team. Yay! But these little things, as I said, you know, we have all this death and destruction and judgment, and then we see God peek through, wink at us, say, you guys need to have 2 thumbs up. We win. And I say we because look who's there. Heaven is there. The saints are there. And that's, I believe, any person who has ever looked at the Creator God and said, you are the Creator God and you're the one I worship. So New Testament, that's through Jesus Christ. Old Testament, it was simply through Yahweh by faith in his system. The apostles were special. They were the sent out ones with the gospel message. And it dawned on me this week, which, whatever. The 12 went out, well, the 11 and then Matthias, went out into the world like this. And John over here keeps hearing about, oh, Peter was killed. Oh, Thaddeus was killed. Oh, John, not John, Andrew. Pretty soon, he literally is the last man standing as he's writing this. So when he writes you saints and apostles, it's like talking about family members who are no longer with us. They're gone. And the prophets, of course, we understand who they were. Why? Why do we rejoice? Because God, let me read my notes, because I wrote it the way I wanted it to be translated. Rejoice over her, heavens and so on, because God judged your judgment against her. So remember earlier in Revelation, it's like, when, O Lord, when? We'll get there. We got there. So he does this, and we're going to find out, because I am going to finish. I'm going to read 21 through 24. Then a strong angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, so will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence, and will not be found any longer. And the sound of harpists and musicians and flute players and trumpeters will not be heard in you any longer. And no craftsman of any craft will be found in you any longer. And the sound of a mill will not be heard in you any longer. And the light of the lamp will not shine in you any longer. And the voice of the bridegroom and bride will not be heard in you any longer. We find out why. For you merchants were the great men of the earth, because all the nations, get this, were deceived by your sorcery. Final verse. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all those who have been slain on the earth. Quickly, anybody that's ever been in the water or by a swimming pool, when you drop something in, if it's in a lake or the ocean, say goodbye. If it's in the pool, you can dive in and get it. My iPhone went in the pool and I got it. It never worked right, but when it goes in, and we're talking about the ocean, so when it goes in, it's gone. A strong angel took a stone like a great millstone, so this isn't a pebble. It's big. Threw it into the sea and said, so will Babylon the Great be thrown down with violence. A violent conclusion. This is not a whimpering, die in your sleep. This is a violent conclusion. Whatever that entails entirely, I don't know. I know she's burned up with smoke. I know there's nothing there. That's not just the matter the cupboards are bare. There's no cupboards. There's nothing there. But she's going to be thrown down. And again, let me read this in the Greek so that I say it the way I want to. And in your notes, I highlighted all of those in yellow. U, me, eurythe, eti. Will never be found again. Will never be heard in you again. Will never be found in you again. Will never be heard in you again. Will not be manifested in you again. Will not be heard in you again. It's a conclusion. So in verse 21, she will have a violent conclusion. In verse 22, there's not going to be any more entertainment. In verse 22, there's not going to be any more craftsmanship. In verse 22, there's going to be no more production. In verse 23, this is crazy. There's not going to be any more energy. So did somebody just do this? Or do this? Or is there simply no energy available from anything. Don't know. Won't matter to me. But there's no energy. And the normal living is done. It's not just a matter that he happened to name, and he could have said, and there will be no soccer games. But why did he name bride and bridegroom? Because that's life. It began with Adam and Eve, and that's how we live. Family, men, women, families. Men, women, families. Men, women, families. Generation after generation after generation. There's no more. Normal living is done. It's gone. We find the reasons for that. Why is all of that? He gives us 3 reasons. Nope, 2 reasons. Because everyone was misled. And the word there is pharmakeia. Her sorcery, that's the word pharmakeia. Does that sound like a word we might be looking at in the near future? Even now? Yes, it deals with drugs. It deals with witchcraft. It deals with all those ugly, nasty, awful things that you and I never, ever want to be a part of or cross into that line or that venue in any way. Sorcery is real, and there's people that have literally, today, sold themselves to the devil. I don't get it. I don't personally get it. And it's not a story that we read in our history or English books back when we were 7th graders. This is real stuff happening today. Second reason, verse 24. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all who have been slain in the world. So what has the world system done consistently with God? Well, the easy thing is to say, I've set up this idol, and then I'm going to do whatever the idol, the priest of the idol tells me to do. So if it's to kill my neighbor, I'll do that. If it's to give sheep, I'll give that. If it's to do immoral things, I'll do that. That's what the world system does. But it doesn't stop there. See, that world system hates God, hates everything about God, hates the responsibility and accountability that I might have to face a God. So, how do we know they hated God? It's evidenced by her continuous, murderous attitude toward God's people. And it happens today. And it happens in civilized countries. When you are referred to, and I won't even give any of the names that you are called, because you know what they are. So, let's see if I have a cross-reference here. Chapter 17, verse 6, and I saw the woman drunk with the blood of saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. What do we find here before we head into chapter 19 next week? We find that things are coming to an end. We're no longer back at the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. That's right up here in front. We're no longer at that middle section that Jesus said, watch out, as soon as you see the abomination of desolation, run away. We've already seen that. We've passed that. We are now in this section, and I can't pinpoint right here, right here, right here. That's why I do this. But we're at the end. And the Antichrist is here and gone so quickly. I refer to that as the spiritual whack-a-mole. He's here for only 7 years, of which 3.5 he's in charge. But even that, he's got 144,000 witnesses. He's got the Jewish people hiding that he can't get to. He's got enemies coming from the east that are coming over to attack him, but I think they all agree at the last minute that it's better to attack him because we can get him. So, yeah, never understood that either. But that's where we're going. So chapter 19 will be moving into that. It'll be much happier, much more in the realm of yay! Yeah, exactly. Rather than this, it's like, all these people are mourning and weeping because they've been so bad. God is judging them. All right, there we go. I'd say any questions, but I don't want to go there. So. You've got questions. That's okay. I have questions when I go into this, and you want to do it? What? Let's close in prayer. Father God, we are so grateful that in your plan you've laid things out. And even though some of these things, we kind of, didn't we already see that earlier? Yeah, well, you did. You're just repeating it. You're emphasizing it. You're making it clearer. And Lord, we continue to need your Spirit to unfold these things for us. The big takeaway today is that we need to be ready. And we win. But you haven't called us home yet. So until that day, may we be faithful servants of yours. I pray for each of us to follow your path closely. In Jesus' name, amen.